Alex smiled, remembering how scared he'd been just a year ago. "You absolutely can," he told her. "Want to meet my flight instructor?" As Captain Walker talked with the girl and her parents, Michael stood back, watching the scene unfold. His assistant approached with the latest statistics: complaints down, employee satisfaction up, and the airline now ranked #1 in customer trust. "We did good, didn't we, Dad?" Alex asked, joining him. Michael pulled his son into a hug. "No, buddy, you did good. You turned a moment of fear into a movement for change." Later that evening, at the celebration dinner, crews from different airlines shared stories and plans for the future. The wall behind them displayed their new industry-wide motto: "Every passenger, every flight, every time." Mrs. Chen raised her glass in a toast. "To Alex," she said, "who showed us that sometimes the youngest people can teach us the biggest lessons." Captain Walker added his own words. "And to second chances, may we all learn to give them and deserve them." As the night wound down, Alex sat with his father, watching the sunset through the hotel's windows. "Dad," he said suddenly, "remember when you told me that real heroes don't just stand up for themselves?" Michael nodded, remembering that conversation from a year ago. "I think I understand now," Alex continued. "It's not about getting back at people who hurt you. It's about making sure nobody else gets hurt the same way." Michael looked at his son, seeing not just the boy who'd been wronged on that flight, but the young man who'd helped change an entire industry. Sometimes the biggest victories came from the smallest moments of courage. Outside, planes took off into the darkening sky, carrying thousands of passengers. But now, each flight carried something else too: the promise that everyone deserved to feel welcome, respected, and safe in the skies. 1 year later, the main conference hall of the National Aviation Summit was packed with industry leaders, reporters, and airline representatives. The spotlight shone on the stage, where 13-year-old Alex stood at the podium, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the crowd. "When I was removed from that flight last year, I felt small and scared," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "But my dad taught me something important that day. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes." In the front row, Michael watched his son with pride. Next to him sat Captain Walker, now the head of the airline's new inclusion and training division. The past year had transformed not just that airline, but the entire industry. "The program we started," Alex continued, "has now been adopted by 23 airlines across the country. Over 10,000 airline employees have gone through the training, and passenger complaints about discrimination have dropped by 70%. The screen behind him showed statistics and success stories, but it wasn't just about numbers, it was about real people and real changes. Mrs. Chen, now promoted to head of customer experience, stood at the back of the hall. She remembered that morning at O'Hare like it was yesterday, how different things were now. Flight attendants no longer feared reporting problems, and passengers from all backgrounds felt more welcome. "But the best part," Alex said, smiling, "is what happened last week. I flew alone again, this time to visit my mom. And guess who my pilot was?" The audience murmured as Captain Walker stood up, walking to join Alex on stage. The same man who had once thrown Alex off a flight was now one of his biggest supporters. "Alex taught me more than any training manual ever could," Walker said, his voice thick with emotion. "He showed me that it's never too late to change, to learn, to become better." The presentation continued with video testimonials from passengers and crew members. Stories of positive changes, of people speaking up, of problems being addressed openly instead of ignored. "Remember that viral video of me being removed from the plane?" Alex asked the audience. "Well, now it's shown in training sessions across the country, not to shame anyone, but to teach everyone that one moment of bias can change lives, for better or worse. It's our choice which way it goes." In the crowd, Linda Powell sat with representatives from other airlines. The investigation she led had grown into something much bigger. Airlines were sharing best practices, creating industry-wide standards, and working together to ensure all passengers felt safe and respected. "The app we developed," Alex demonstrated on the big screen, has been downloaded by over 1 million travelers. It lets them rate their experience, report concerns, and see how airlines are handling diversity and inclusion. The presentation shifted to showing the newest addition to the airline's training center, a wall of stories. Passengers and crew members shared their experiences, both good and bad, creating a living history of change. Last month, Alex said proudly, "I started taking flying lessons. Captain Walker is one of my teachers. He says I have a natural talent, but I think what he really means is that I'm stubborn, just like my dad." Laughter rippled through the audience. Michael grinned, remembering all the weekend mornings he'd spent watching Alex in the flight simulator, his son's determination growing with each session. After the presentation, people crowded around to shake Alex's hand. A young girl pushed through the crowd with her parents. "I saw your video last year," she said shyly. "Now I want to be a pilot too. My dad says if you can do it, I can do it." "Because of what you're doing now," Michael corrected. He says anyone can make a mistake, but it takes real courage to admit it and try to fix it. Later that evening, as the training center emptied out, Michael sat in his office reviewing feedback forms from the day's sessions. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, but one stood out. "For the first time in my 15 years of flying, I feel like we're not just talking about change, we're actually making it happen." His phone buzzed again, another text from Alex. "Dad, when can I come see the training center?" "Mom says it's okay if you say yes." Michael looked out his window at the sunset, painting the sky in brilliant colors. On the runway below, planes were taking off and landing, carrying thousands of passengers from all walks of life. Each one deserved to feel safe, respected, and welcome. He typed back, "This weekend, and guess who asked to meet you? Captain Walker. He says he has some real apologizing to do." The response came quickly. "Tell him I forgave him already, but I still want to hear about becoming a pilot." As Michael put down his phone, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the worst moments in life led to the best changes. His son's difficult experience had sparked a transformation that would help countless others, and maybe, just maybe, it had helped everyone involved become better people along the way. 3 months after the board meeting, the airline's main training center was filled with activity. Captain Walker stood at the back of the room, watching as flight crews from different airlines participated in the new industry-leading diversity training program. His uniform was different now, no captain's stripes, just a simple trainer's badge. It had been his choice to step down from flying temporarily to help develop and lead these sessions. "The hardest part," he was saying to the group, "is recognizing our own biases. I didn't think I had any until I was forced to watch myself on video, making assumptions about a 12-year-old boy just because of how he looked." The room was quiet, every face focused on him. These weren't the usual boring corporate training sessions. This was real, raw, and personal. In his office upstairs, Michael reviewed the latest reports. Passenger complaints about discrimination had dropped significantly across all routes. More importantly, crew members were actively reporting and addressing concerns before they became incidents. His phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dad, guess what? My story is going to be in my school newspaper. The editor says it's important for kids to know they can stand up for themselves." Michael smiled, remembering how far they'd come since that morning at O'Hare. The changes hadn't been easy, but they were making a difference. Back in the training room, Mrs. Chen was sharing her perspective. "It's not just about avoiding discrimination," she explained to the group. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome and safe." A young flight attendant raised her hand. "But what if we're unsure about something? Sometimes it's hard to know when to speak up." "That's exactly why we're here," Captain Walker stepped in. "Let me tell you about the new reporting system we've put in place." He pulled up a presentation showing the airline's new mobile app. Any crew member could now report concerns instantly, and the system was designed to protect both passengers and employees. No more fear of retaliation, no more looking the other way. In another part of the building, Linda Powell was meeting with representatives from other airlines. The program had gained so much attention that competitors were asking to join the initiative. "We're not keeping this to ourselves," she explained, spreading out the training materials. "Real change happens when the whole industry moves forward together." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as Captain Walker wrapped up his session. "Before you leave today," he said, "I want to share something personal." He pulled up the now famous video of the incident with Alex. "I watch this every morning before training, not to punish myself, but to remember why we're here. One moment of bias can change someone's life forever." After the session, A pilot from another airline approached him. "I've probably done similar things without even realizing it," he admitted quietly. "How do you deal with the guilt?" Walker thought for a moment. "You acknowledge it, learn from it, and work to be better. That's all any of us can do." In the cafeteria, crews from different airlines mingled during their break. The conversations were different now, more open, more honest. People shared their own experiences, both as witnesses and recipients of bias. "Yesterday, I spoke up when I saw something wrong," a ground crew member was saying. "Before this training, I might have stayed quiet, but now I know silence only makes things worse." Michael stepped into the training center late that afternoon. He watched from the doorway as Captain Walker worked with a small group, role-playing difficult situations and discussing solutions. "Mr. Zhang," Walker said, noticing him. "I was just telling them about Alex. Hope that's okay." Michael nodded. "Alex would be proud. He told me yesterday that he wants to be a pilot when he grows up." The room fell silent. Walker's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "After what I did." The room was silent. Walker looked down at the folder in front of him, then at the frozen video image on the screen, his own face twisted in prejudice. "I never thought of myself as," he started, then stopped. "I always had a reason, an explanation, but seeing it all laid out like this." Michael nodded. "The hardest things to see are often the things closest to us. The question is, what do you want to do about it now?" As the board members watched, Captain Walker slowly closed the folder and looked up at Michael. "Your son," he said quietly, "is he really okay?" "He's strong," Michael replied. "But this isn't just about him anymore, is it?" In that moment, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just about one incident, one pilot, or one airline anymore. It was about facing uncomfortable truths and choosing to do better. The board meeting continued for hours, but its impact would last for years. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a boy with a navy blue backpack standing his ground in the face of injustice. The morning of the board meeting dawned bright and clear. The airline's headquarters buzzed with nervous energy as board members filed into the main conference room. Captain Walker sat at one end of the long table, his union representative beside him. His usual confident smile had been replaced by a tense expression as he flipped through the thick folder of evidence in front of him. "This is all circumstantial," his representative was saying quietly. "They can't prove intent." But Walker wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for the CEO to arrive. He'd never met Michael Zhang in person. Few people had since the new CEO's appointment 3 months ago. Rumors said he was a straight shooter who'd worked his way up from the bottom. The room fell silent as Linda Powell began presenting the investigation's findings. Slide after slide showed patterns of behavior, statistics, and testimonies. Walker's face grew paler with each new piece of evidence. "Over the past 3 years," Linda explained, pointing to a graph, flights under Captain Walker's command show a disturbing pattern of passenger removals. The demographic breakdown of these incidents is particularly concerning. One of the board members leaned forward. "And all of this went unnoticed until now." "Not unnoticed," Linda corrected. "Unreported. Our investigation revealed a culture of silence that we need to address." The door opened quietly, and Michael Zhang walked in. Several board members straightened in their seats. Captain Walker barely glanced up, still absorbed in his own thoughts. "I apologize for being late," Michael said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I was on a video call with my son. He's doing well, by the way. Much better since that unfortunate incident at O'Hare last week." The room went completely still. Captain Walker's head snapped up, his face draining of what little color it had left. "Your son," he managed to say. Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, Alex. The 12-year-old boy you removed from your flight. Remember him? Navy blue backpack, proper documentation, everything in order." The union representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Walker opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. "But this meeting isn't about my son," Michael continued, his voice calm and measured. "It's about every passenger who's ever felt unwelcome or unsafe on our airlines. It's about every employee who felt they couldn't speak up. It's about doing better." He opened his laptop and pulled up a familiar video, the one of Alex being removed from the plane. "Captain Walker, I'd like you to watch this. not as a pilot, not as an employee, but as a human being. The video played on the large screen. Walker watched himself, seeing his actions through new eyes. The subtle dismissal in his tone, the unfounded accusations, the casual cruelty, it all looked different now. I was following security protocols, Walker said weakly. Were you? Michael asked quietly. Or were you following something else? Something you might not even want to admit to yourself? Linda stepped forward, presenting more evidence. Reports from other crew members, statistics showing patterns of bias, testimonies from affected passengers. With each new piece of information, the reality of Walker's actions became clearer. The easy thing would be to fire you, Michael said, standing up. It would make for great headlines. CEO fires pilot who discriminated against his son. But that wouldn't solve the real problem. He walked to the window, looking out at the airfield below where planes were taking off and landing. My son called me a hero the other day. Not because I'm a CEO, but because I taught him that real change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from transformation. Turning back to the room, Michael unveiled his plan. A complete overhaul of the airline's training programs. New reporting systems for discrimination incidents. Partnership programs with other airlines to share best practices and create industry-wide standards. Captain Walker, Michael said, you have a choice to make. You can fight these findings, claim discrimination against yourself, and we'll handle that accordingly. Or you can be part of the solution. You can help us understand how these biases develop, how they become normalized, and how we can prevent them. In the staff break room, conversations had shifted. People who had stayed quiet before were speaking up, sharing their own experiences. A culture of silence was being replaced by one of openness. I saw him turn away a grandmother last month, one gate agent confided to another. Said her ID looked suspicious. She missed her granddaughter's graduation. The investigation team worked late into the night, ordering takeout and reviewing security footage from various flights. They weren't just building a case against one pilot anymore. They were documenting the need for systemic change. Linda saved the most crucial interview for last. Captain Walker himself was scheduled for the following morning. He had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, his confident demeanor finally showing cracks as the evidence mounted. He's requested to have his union representative present, Linda's assistant informed her. Good, Linda replied, organizing her notes. He'll need one. That evening, as the investigation team prepared for the next day's crucial interview, Michael sat in his office reviewing their preliminary findings. The situation had grown far beyond what anyone had expected, revealing not just one person's bias, but an entire system that needed reform. He thought about Alex, who had unwittingly sparked this whole process. His son's experience, painful as it was, might end up protecting countless other passengers in the future. Sometimes, Michael reflected, the worst moments led to the most important changes. His phone lit up with another message from Alex. Dad, when are you coming to visit? Mom says you're doing something really important. Michael smiled, typing his response. Very important, buddy. We're making sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else again. As night fell over the city, the investigation team's office lights still burned bright. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they'd been building toward, but the real work, the lasting changes, was just beginning. The airline's investigation room buzzed with activity as Linda Powell, the lead investigator, spread documents across the large conference table. After 30 years in corporate investigations, she thought she'd seen everything. But the stack of complaints and witness statements about Captain Walker made her shake her head in disbelief. Another one just came in, her assistant said, placing a fresh report on the pile. A flight attendant from the Denver route says she's been wanting to speak up for months but was afraid of losing her job. Linda picked up the report, her eyes scanning the details. Since the video of Alex's incident had gone viral, more and more airline employees had found the courage to come forward. Each story painted a clearer picture of a pattern that should have been addressed long ago. In another part of the building, Mrs. Chen sat in a small interview room, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. It wasn't just that day with Alex, she explained to the HR representative. There were little things. The way he'd speak to certain passengers, how he'd suddenly find problems with their carry-on bags or documentation. The HR rep nodded, typing quickly. And you said others noticed too. Everyone noticed, Mrs. Chen said firmly. But Captain Walker had been with the airline for so long, and he always had an explanation ready. He'd call it security concerns or following protocol. After a while, people just stopped questioning it. Meanwhile, in the 8 department, technicians were reviewing flight logs and crew reports from the past 3 years. The data painted an interesting picture. Flights under Captain Walker had a significantly higher rate of passenger complaints and pre-flight removals, particularly involving minorities and unaccompanied minors. Look at this pattern, one analyst pointed out, highlighting a series of incidents. He's careful, never enough to raise major red flags, but when you put it all together. The investigation was spreading beyond just Captain Walker now. Linda's team was looking into why previous complaints hadn't been properly addressed, why the airline's oversight systems hadn't caught these patterns sooner. Each answer led to more questions, revealing cracks in the system that needed fixing. Up in his office, Michael received regular updates but maintained his distance from the investigation. He wanted everything done by the book, with no hint of personal influence. The evidence needed to stand on its own. His phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dad, my video hit 1 million views. Some kids at school are calling me a hero." Michael smiled, typing back, "Remember what we talked about? Real heroes don't just stand up for themselves, they help make things better for others too." Back in the investigation room, Linda was interviewing a junior pilot who had worked with Captain Walker. The young man fidgeted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. He would make these comments during pre-flight checks, the pilot explained. Little things, jokes about passengers. If anyone looked uncomfortable, he'd say we needed thicker skin to work in aviation. Some of us tried to avoid being assigned to his flights. By the end of the week, Linda had filled 3 thick binders with evidence. Employee testimonies, flight records, passenger complaints, and social media responses, it all told the same story. But what struck her most were the recent messages from other airlines sharing similar experiences with other crew members. "This isn't just our airline's problem," she told Michael during their daily briefing. "The whole industry needs to take a hard look at itself." Michael nodded, thinking of Alex. Sometimes it takes one small stone to start an avalanche. The next morning, Michael arrived at his office earlier than usual. His assistant was already there, armed with coffee and a stack of newspapers, all featuring stories about the incident. "The captain's trying to reach you," she said, handing him his messages. "Says it's urgent." "I'm sure it is," Michael replied calmly, placing the messages in his drawer without reading them. "Please schedule a full board meeting for next week, and get me the contact information for every major airline's diversity and inclusion officer." His assistant raised an eyebrow. "Planning something big?" Michael looked at the photo on his desk. Alex's last school picture, his son's smile bright and confident. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it takes a small incident to spark a big change." He spent the rest of the morning in meetings with his legal team, HR directors, and training coordinators. Each conversation built upon the last, creating a framework for real, lasting change. He wasn't just going to address one captain's actions, he was going to transform how the entire airline approached issues of bias and discrimination. By the end of the day, Michael had set in motion a plan that would reshape not just his airline, but potentially the entire industry. And somewhere in Seattle, Alex was finishing his dinner, unaware that his experience was about to help thousands of other passengers in the future. As Michael finally headed home that evening, he smiled thinking about how Captain Walker still had no idea who Alex's father was. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful moves were the ones made quietly, with purpose rather than fanfare. The real victory wouldn't be in watching one pilot face consequences, it would be in making sure no other child ever had to face what Alex did. Michael Zhang sat in his home office that evening, surrounded by the warm glow of his desk lamp. Alex had finally made it to Seattle on a different airline's flight, and Michael had just finished a heartwarming video call with both his son and ex-wife. Now, as the city lights twinkled outside his window, he began the real work. His computer screen displayed multiple windows, airline policies regarding unaccompanied minors, employee conduct guidelines, and most importantly, the growing social media storm about the morning's incident. The videos taken by passengers had gone viral, with thousands of comments expressing outrage at Captain Walker's behavior. Some news outlets were already picking up the story. "You should just fire him," Michael's assistant had suggested earlier that day. "You have the power to do it with one phone call." But Michael knew better. He'd faced discrimination throughout his career, climbing from a junior analyst position to CEO. Each time, he'd learned that quick revenge might feel good for a moment, but real change required something more substantial. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. His pen moved quickly across the yellow paper as he outlined his approach. This wasn't just about one pilot or one incident anymore. This was about changing an entire system. His phone buzzed. Another message from Mrs. Chen. She had sent him the official incident report she'd filed, along with statements from 3 other flight attendants who had witnessed similar behavior from Captain Walker in the past, but had been afraid to report it. Michael's jaw tightened as he read their accounts. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Dad?" Alex's voice came through the video call that was still running on his tablet. "Are you still there?" Michael smiled at his son's image on the screen. "Just working on some important things, buddy. How's Mom's cooking?" "She made my favorite noodles." Alex grinned, then his expression grew serious. "Dad, some kids at Mom's neighborhood saw the video. They're calling me brave, but I don't feel brave. I was scared." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Michael replied, setting down his pen. "It means doing the right thing even when you were scared. You stood there with dignity, just like we talked about. That's real courage." After saying goodnight to Alex, Michael returned to his work with renewed purpose. He spent hours drafting a comprehensive plan. First, he arranged for an independent investigation team to review not just this incident, but all reported cases of discrimination within the airline over the past 5 years. He wanted data, patterns, everything. Next, he drafted a new training program, not just another routine sensitivity seminar, but a complete overhaul of how the airline handled diversity and inclusion. He thought about Alex's face when he'd called from the terminal, and about all the other children who might have faced similar situations without having a CEO father to help them. Around midnight, his phone rang. It was Tom Chen, the head of the airline's board of directors, probably having just heard about the viral videos. Michael let it go to voicemail. The board would find out about everything soon enough, but not until he had all his pieces in place. He opened his email and began composing a message to the airline's HR department. They would need to schedule interviews with every employee who had worked with Captain Walker. Not to build a case against him, though that might happen naturally, but to understand how such behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked. As he worked, Michael remembered something his own father had told him years ago. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But also believe that people can change if given the right motivation and opportunity. Meanwhile, in his office, Michael Zhang ended the call and took a moment to collect his thoughts. He looked out his window at the city skyline, remembering his own experiences climbing the corporate ladder, the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination he'd faced. He had become CEO not just to break barriers but to change things from the inside out. Opening his laptop, Michael began to type. Not an angry email demanding immediate action, but something more methodical. He would handle this his way, not with a sudden strike of lightning, but with the steady, unstoppable force of a rising tide. Captain Richard Walker had no idea that his actions today would lead to the biggest wake-up call of his career. And somewhere in the terminal, as Mrs. Chen helped him book a new flight, Alex felt a strange sort of peace. He didn't know exactly what his father was planning, but he knew it would be something that would help not just him, but other kids who might face the same situation in the future. That's just who his dad was, someone who turned problems into possibilities, hope into hope. Back in the terminal, Alex sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest like a shield. Mrs. Chen hadn't left his side, and she was now speaking quietly with another flight attendant who kept shooting concerned glances in their direction. The morning sun that had seemed so bright and promising earlier now felt harsh and exposing through the huge airport windows. "Dad?" Alex's voice cracked slightly when his father finally answered the phone. Something happened. They won't let me on the plane. Michael Zhang was in the middle of a crucial meeting when his phone rang. The moment he heard his son's trembling voice, everything else became background noise. 20 pairs of eyes watched as their newly appointed CEO stood up abruptly from the conference table, his usual calm demeanor shifting into something more alert and focused. "Take a deep breath, buddy," Michael said softly, already gathering his things. "Tell me exactly what happened." As Alex recounted the events, his father's free hand tightened around his briefcase handle. The other meeting attendees couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see their boss's expression darkening with each passing second. None of them knew that Michael had specifically chosen this airline for his son's flight, not because he was the CEO, but because he wanted Alex to travel like any other passenger. He wanted his son to learn independence, to feel confident traveling alone. "The captain said my papers looked irregular," Alex finished, his voice steadier now that he was talking to his dad. "But Mrs. Chen checked them twice and she said they were fine." Back in the terminal, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Some were passengers from the flight who had chosen to stay behind, troubled by what they'd witnessed. A young woman with glasses approached Mrs. Chen, holding up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing," she said quietly, "if you need it for the report." Michael's voice came through Alex's phone, warm and reassuring. "You did nothing wrong, son. I'm proud of how you're handling this. Can you put Mrs. Chen on the phone?" The flight attendant took the phone, her professional composure never wavering. "This is Grace Chen speaking." "Mrs. Chen, I want to thank you for staying with my son," Michael said, his tone measured. "I understand you verified his documentation twice." "Yes, sir. Everything was in perfect order. I've been handling unaccompanied minors for 15 years, and I've never—" "I understand," Michael interrupted gently. "Would you mind telling me Captain Walker's first name?" Mrs. Chen's eyes widened slightly at the specific request. "Richard Walker, sir." "Thank you. Now I'm going to ask you to do something unusual." Michael's voice took on a different tone, one that Mrs. Chen immediately recognized as someone used to giving orders. "Please don't mention my name or position to anyone. I want you to file your report exactly as you would in any other situation. Can you do that for me?" "Of course, sir," Mrs. Chen replied, curiosity evident in her voice. "One more thing," Michael added. "Please help Alex book a seat on the next available flight. Any airline is fine. I'll handle the arrangements on my end." As Mrs. Chen handed the phone back to Alex, she noticed more people approaching, airline staff who had heard about the incident. The young woman with the video was now showing it to a customer service representative who looked increasingly concerned. Other passengers were sharing their own recordings on social media, their fingers flying over their phones as they described what they'd witnessed. "Dad," Alex's voice was smaller now, "I'm sorry about messing up your day." "Hey, look at me," Michael said firmly, and Alex could picture his father's expression perfectly. The one he always had when he was about to say something important. "You didn't mess up anything. Sometimes in life, we run into people who try to make us feel small because of who we are. But that's their problem, not ours. What matters is how we respond." As Alex listened to his father's words, he noticed something interesting. The angry knot in his stomach was starting to unwind, replaced by a different feeling. It wasn't quite pride, but something close to it. He was hurt and embarrassed, yes, but he had stood his ground. He had kept his dignity just like his dad had taught him. The bright morning sun streamed through the airport's massive windows as 12-year-old Alex made his way through the bustling terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. His navy blue backpack was stuffed with his favorite comics, a tablet loaded with games, and enough snacks to last the entire flight to Seattle. This wasn't his first time flying alone. He was practically a pro at being an unaccompanied minor by now. A kind flight attendant with graying hair named Mrs. Chen had already checked his paperwork twice, ensuring everything was in order for his journey to visit his mom. "Don't worry, sweetie," she'd said with a warm smile. "We'll take good care of you." Alex liked her immediately. She reminded him of his grandmother. But the calm, excited feeling Alex had been carrying suddenly shifted when he reached the airplane door. Captain Richard Walker stood there, his pressed uniform and polished badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The moment the captain's eyes landed on Alex, something changed in his expression, a subtle tightening around his mouth, a slight narrowing of his eyes. "Paperwork," Captain Walker demanded, his voice sharp enough to make Alex flinch. The boy fumbled with his documents, hands slightly shaking as he pulled them from his backpack's front pocket. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, confusion clear on her face. "Captain, I've already verified his documentation. Everything's in order for—" "I'll be the judge of that," Captain Walker cut her off, snatching the papers from Alex's hands. He made a show of examining each document, his frown deepening with every page turn. Other passengers were starting to board now, streaming past them with curious glances. Alex stood there, trying to keep his breathing steady. He'd done nothing wrong, he knew that. His dad had triple-checked everything before dropping him off at the airport. They'd followed every rule, filled out every form. Still, something in the captain's eyes made his stomach twist into knots. "These documents seem irregular," Captain Walker announced, though he couldn't quite meet Mrs. Chen's questioning gaze. "I can't verify their authenticity. This is a security concern." Alex's voice came out smaller than he wanted. "But sir, my dad filled everything out exactly like the airline asked. I have my ID and—" "I'm the captain of this aircraft," Walker interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "And I'm saying you're not boarding my plane today. This is a matter of passenger safety." A few nearby passengers had stopped to watch now. One woman had her phone out, recording discreetly. Mrs. Chen stepped closer to Alex, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Captain, with all due respect, I've handled hundreds of unaccompanied minors. His paperwork is completely standard and properly filled out. There's no reason. Are you questioning my authority on my own aircraft?" Captain Walker's face had reddened slightly. "I've made my decision. Get him off my plane. Now." Alex felt tears pricking at his eyes but fought them back. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of everyone. His dad had always taught him to hold his head high, even when people tried to make him feel small. Mrs. Chen's hand tightened protectively on his shoulder. "I'll need to document this decision, Captain," she said, her voice professional but with an edge of steel. "And I'll need to contact his father immediately." "Do whatever paperwork you need to do." Walker dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Just get him out of here. We're on a schedule." As Mrs. Chen gently guided Alex back to the terminal, he could hear the whispers of other passengers. Some were expressing outrage, others just confusion. One businessman in a sharp suit was already on his phone, apparently calling the airline's customer service. In the terminal, Alex's hands shook as he pulled out his phone to call his dad. He didn't know it yet, but that call would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire airline industry. Because while Captain Walker was so busy flexing his authority, he had no idea that he just discriminated against the son of Michael Zhang, the newly appointed CEO of the airline's parent company. As the phone rang, Alex took a deep breath. His dad had always told him that sometimes the hardest moments in life became the most important ones. He was about to learn just how right his father was.